everybody, this is Robert with Sigma 3 Survival School, and I wanted to talk to y'all a little bit today about bow drill. Bow drill is a really elusive skill. There's 50,000 things to remember. I mean, it's probably the easiest of all the primitive fires, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of things to remember. In fact, I brought my notebook just so I wouldn't forget anything for y'all. As far as the spindle's concerned, you want something, a lot of people say about the hang 10 length, which is usually about 7 to 10 inches. This is a big deal. Not a lot of people do this. You need to make a large taper from far back here all the way up to the tip, and you want it fairly pointed right here because you want reduced friction into the handhold so that you get maximum friction at the base and minimum friction up here. This is what gets people a lot of the times towards the end of the bow drill, because they'll grind this down and then it'll get to the fat part, and then it'll cause so much friction they can't get enough heat to get that last bit of energy to bust it into a coal. The texture needs to be just slightly rough, but you don't want it so rough that it's going to abrade your cordage, because cordage is probably the weakest part of the bow drill. Your tip here needs to be slightly blunted. I actually make mine a little bit more pointed. This will prevent basically the spindle from flipping out. And as it grinds down into it, it will actually flatten it out, and once you dig into the board, you'll get that maximum friction. As far as your fireboard's concerned, you don't want anything too long, just long enough, to get your foot up on, because the problem with having a really long fireboard is that a lot of the times you'll get one side that is higher than the other, and you don't want it warped, because if you step on one side and the other side's higher than the other, it has a tendency to lift it up or down, which can create your notch lifting off the ground, which is a big problem. So keep your board fairly short. You also want it to be about a ½ inch thick. You don't want it too thick. A lot of it is dependent upon the kind of woods that you're using. If you're using a softer wood on your fireboard, or for your spindle as well, you want to make it sure it's a little bit thicker, because you're going to grind through it really, really quickly. Like a yucca, for instance, that's a really soft wood, or a willow is a little bit softer. That's what this board is made out of. Let's see. When you cut your notch, this isn't the most beautiful notch I've ever created, but you want it to be about 1/8 of the pie. You don't want it too deep. You don't want to take it so far into the notch that you're completely in the middle. And another thing that I do is I'll kind of make kind of carve the base out of it. I don't know how to describe it, so that your coal kind of forms a pyramid instead of a column straight up and down, so that when it forms, it doesn't fall apart when you pull the board away. That's real important. It can really help you out. Let's see. Your bow, if you're using natural cordage, you want it to be probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of the length of, if you're going to use man-made cordage, because you need to cant the bow slightly in order for the cordage not to abrade on itself, which is a real big problem for natural cordage. If you're using something like yucca cordage and you don't have a shorter bow, it will abrade on, or it'll grind on itself, and it'll abrade, and it'll fall apart towards the end of it. And when you do a natural cordage bow drill, you want to cant your bow up and down so that it will not touch on each other, and that's why one of the main reasons you need it shorter. If you're using man-made cordage, I typically go with about armpit to palm length with my personal favorite is probably Paracord. I use bank line a lot, which I carry in my kit, but probably the best cordage out there is lawnmower pull cord, because it's extremely abrasion resistant, and that can be a big deal, especially if you're doing a lot of bow fires. Let's see. If your wood is green, if you decide to go with a green bow, you can actually run it back and forth over the fire in order to form it and shape it into the arc that you want. But if you do go with a green bow, you want to make sure that it's a little bit thicker so that it doesn't have as much flex as a bow that's thinner like this. You also want to make sure that it's not too heavy, because especially with harder woods, you're going to find that towards the end of drilling that your arm starts to get tired from carrying a heavier bow. So try to keep it, you know, probably thumb size, or maybe 3/4 of a, you know, bit bigger than your thumb. Let's see. Lubrication for your handhold. You know, you could put a little bit of pine sap. You can use oil from your nose, earwax, you know, grass clippings. Rub the chlorophyll in there. There's a lot of different things you can use. Just be innovative for your handhold. You want to make sure that your handhold is extremely dense wood, because if it's not really dense, then what will happen is you'll grind up into the handhold, creating more friction when the spindle gets deeper up into it. So you want to make sure, I like hickory, or Osage orange is actually the best. Let's see. Wood materials. You want to do a thumb density check. You know, push your thumbnail in there, see how deep it goes. Usually softer is a little bit better, but there is a point of diminishing returns with that. That's about it. And so the next step is I'm going to demonstrate, you know, the methods that I'm talking about. So hang tight. All right. So the first thing that we're going to do for the bow drill is we're going to take the blunt end and we're going to feed it in to the rope. And we want to make sure that the bow drill is always, or the spindle is always on the outside of your rope and not the inside. Because if it's on the inside, you can go less distance, and it makes it much more difficult. So always make sure you put it on your outside. Another thing I do is I always save every ounce of dust I have. Let's say, you know, on my when I'm heating it up, when I'm doing my burn in, I take that dust and I save it and I put it somewhere else. And the reason I do that is because I'll dump it right under where my notch is at. And then I'll physically feed that dust into the notch so that it takes me less time to fill it up. And this is another reason that I like to notch or flare the bottom of the fireboard out, so that you can have a place that you can hold that dust in there easily. So feed the bow in. You want to make sure that you are able to manipulate the rope with your finger. I prefer to keep my hand at the back of the bow and be able to pull with my thumb and my pointer finger down, so that towards the end, you know, let's say your cord is stretching out a little bit. That way you can add extra tension, you know, when you're putting more pressure on the handhold. Here's the handhold. This is a hardened piece of hickory. It's got a little, you know, a little finger hold up here, which comes in real handy. And you'll notice that I don't let my handhold hole get very deep at all. That's why it's really important that you have an extremely dense wood, because one of the main reasons that problems that people have is towards the end, you know, they'll get a whole lot of smoke, and then it'll start to get really hard to crank on the bow as they increase pressure. It's because they've created a heavy gouge in here and you're getting too much friction in your handhold. So make sure that it's not too deep, and you also make sure that there's a large taper here towards the end. And you want to keep your foot real close to the hole so that the board can't move around too much, and in case it is off to one side, it's not going to lift it up at an inopportune time. You want to make sure that your bow drill is completely parallel, because if you go up like this, the cord's going to go, you know, up the spindle. If you angle it down, the rope's going to go down the spindle. So we want to make sure that it's completely parallel with the ground. We want to plant our left foot here. We want our right foot, if we're right-handed, switch it if you're left. We want them to be in line so that we can get a perfect, you know, bow. And you're going to start light, and light with the pressure, higher with the speed. Try to build up the dust. And then you're going to slowly increase the pressure. After you're sure you've got a coal, you know, wait for that white smoke. You want to feed it. You want to feed it air. Let it build. You know, don't rush it. I've had coals that will burn for 30 minutes if you do them large enough. Alright, so we got a coal. Next thing is, you're going to feed that excess dust that you've got on top of your board. Make sure you don't smother it. And then the next step is we're going to feed it into a Tinder Bundle. Alright, so the next step is, once we get our coal, you know, this is a pretty good size one, at least quarter size. You want to kind of fold it in like a sandwich. You don't want to just take it and dump it, otherwise certain wood types will fall apart. So just kind of slowly feed it in there, there's no rush. Give it a little air. And try to keep the dust together. And you want to kind of fold it together like a sandwich. Ooh. And one of the tricks is, you know, if you've got a higher amount of tinder on this side, you want to blow in that direction. Don't blow towards your hand. Also, hold it above your head. I hardly ever see anybody do this. This way you don't choke yourself out with the smoke. And it's that simple. You got fire. And that's how, I mean, this wasn't meant to be a complete start to finish bow drill video. This is really to give you kind of the tips and tricks that other people aren't explaining to you, because there are so many different things out there, little things that you can do that will make the bow drill tremendously easier, especially on more difficult wood. So if you've got anything to comment on this, I know we've got a lot of primitive fire experts out there. Drop us some commentary, you know, let us know what you use, and please help support us by subscribing. Thanks.